On April 24th, 2026, at exactly 8:52 in the morning Eastern Time, Canada did something it has not done in a generation. It stopped waiting for permission. Two announcements landed within days of each other, both centered in British Columbia, both carrying consequences that stretch far beyond any one province, and both aim squarely at a geopolitical reality that most Western governments are only now beginning to understand. One involves the control of critical minerals at the molecular level. The other involves $4 billion of shovel-ready steel in the ground. Together, they signal something larger than infrastructure. They signal a country that has decided to compete. Here is the thesis. Canada just quietly moved to break China's stranglehold on the global battery supply chain and simultaneously approved the largest natural gas pipeline expansion in British Columbia's recent history on the same week. If you think those two events are unrelated, you are not paying attention. Think about what this means for the person watching this right now. If you work in construction, in energy, in critical minerals, in indigenous enterprise, the ground just shifted beneath your feet, in a good way. If you pay a heating bill in Alberta or British Columbia, the pipeline just moved your costs. If you drive or plan to drive an electric vehicle, the refinery in Delta is the reason the battery in your next car might not be made with material processed in China. This is not abstract policy. This is your life. The human thread running through both stories is the same. It is the worker in Fort St. John or Fort Nelson in northeastern British Columbia, sitting on top of some of the richest natural gas reserves in North America, watching the global energy market scramble for supply in the wake of Middle East instability, and wondering whether Canada is going to finally build the infrastructure to capture that value or let it bleed south across the border once again. We are going to come back to that worker because by the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly what both of these decisions mean for their next 5 years. We know the details of these approvals not from press releases alone, but from multiple simultaneous institutional confirmations. The Enbridge Sunrise expansion approval was announced by Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson in a speech in Toronto on April 24, 2026. It was simultaneously confirmed by Enbridge's official corporate news release, covered by Reuters, Bloomberg, CBC, Global News, BNN Bloomberg, and the Canadian press within hours. There is no ambiguity about the approval, the dollar figure, or the timeline. The details are documented. On the lithium side, the opening of Mangrove Lithium's Delta, British Columbia facility was confirmed by Business Wire on April 16, 2026, by CBC News, Electrek, oilprice.com, and the Institute of Materials, Minerals, and Mining within the same week. The ribbon-cutting ceremony included the Canadian government's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. We have seen the footage. We have the corporate filings. We have the independent reporting. 3 separate major outlets covered the same event with the same core facts. This is not speculation. These are simultaneous, corroborated institutional events happening in real time. And what they reveal, when you read them together, is a strategic repositioning that most commentators have failed to connect. Picture a nondescript industrial park in Delta, British Columbia. It sits among companies that sell plumbing supplies and ladders and fitness equipment. On April 16, 2026, that industrial park became the most strategically significant square footage in North America's energy transition economy. Inside one of those unassuming buildings, a man named Dr. Saad Dara, founder and CEO of Mangrove Lithium, stood in front of a ribbon. Behind him, the machinery that represents the culmination of years of electrochemical research, millions in financing, and a calculated bet that the West needed to stop outsourcing the most critical step in battery production. The ribbon falls, a flashbulb, and then, in plain language, a statement that is going to age very well. We are proving that lithium can be refined domestically, sustainably, and competitively. Here is what that means in the room. The facility uses a patented electrochemical process. Instead of using the aggressive chemical methods that conventional refineries rely on, methods that produce, in China's case, roughly 2.5 tons of waste for every ton of refined material. Mangrove uses electricity to perform ion separation. It is cleaner, it is faster to scale, and it runs on British Columbia's hydroelectric grid, which means the life cycle carbon footprint of the refined material is dramatically lower than anything coming out of a Chinese plant powered by coal. The government minister did not say a word that was improvised. This was coordinated. The presence of a federal minister at a ribbon cutting for a private sector lithium refinery tells you exactly how Ottawa views this asset. They view it as strategic national infrastructure, not a company's product launch. And here is the psychological revelation most reporting missed. When China looks at this facility, it is not looking at a 1,000-ton per year operation in Delta and feeling threatened by the volume. It is looking at the technology. Because the electrochemical process that Mangrove has patented can be replicated, it can be licensed, it can be scaled. The single stack plant in Delta is not the point. The proof of concept is the point. And that proof of concept is now operational. Receipt 1. China refines approximately 65 to 70% of the world's lithium chemicals. They mine only 17 to 22% of raw lithium globally. Read that twice. China controls the refining of 2/3 of the world's lithium supply while digging up less than 1/4 of the raw ore. The rest of the world provides the raw material. China converts it into value and sells it back. This is the oldest extractive trade structure in colonial history, running in reverse, running on battery chemistry. The facility in Delta is the first direct challenge to that structure on this continent. Verdict. The supply chain vulnerability the West has been describing for a decade just got its first serious answer in North America. But that is only part of it. Receipt 2. The Mangrove facility in Delta has a feedstock supply arrangement with North American Lithium's Quebec mining operation. That corridor runs approximately 2,700 miles across Canada. Raw spodumene extracted in the east, shipped west, refined electrochemically in Delta, then available for battery manufacturers. That is the skeleton of the first vertically integrated domestic lithium supply chain in Canadian history. Canada has mines in Manitoba and Quebec. It now has a refinery in British Columbia. The missing link, domestic processing, just became operational. For the worker in Quebec's mining sector, that means their ore no longer has to leave the continent to become a battery-grade product. Their value chain just got longer, and the margin stays in Canada. Verdict: Canada just moved from raw material exporter to value-added processor in the most strategically important industrial category of the next 20 years. Return now to that worker in northeastern British Columbia, the one sitting on top of those gas fields in Fort St. John. Their paycheck depends on whether Canada can build the infrastructure to move the product they extract to markets that will actually pay for it. For years, the answer has been slow, conditional, and increasingly uncertain. On April 24th, that answer changed. Receipt 3. The Enbridge Sunrise expansion adds 300 million cubic feet per day of natural gas transportation capacity to the Westcoast pipeline system, a system that currently moves 3.6 billion cubic feet at peak. That is an 8% increase in raw throughput, achieved by constructing 11 looping pipeline segments over 139 kilometers of new pipe. The projected economic contribution exceeds $3 billion in GDP. Peak construction will employ 2,500 workers, many of them from indigenous communities along the right-of-way. Over $52 million has already been committed to indigenous hiring and procurement before a single segment has gone in the ground. Construction begins in July 2026. In-service target is late 2028. For that worker in Fort St. John, this is not abstract. This is wages, contracts, and the infrastructure that determines whether the gas they extract reaches a ship in Kitimat or a pipeline in Texas. Verdict: Canada just chose the ship. Here is where it gets wider. Receipt 4. The Westcoast system is 12.5% owned by the Stonelesec 8 Indigenous Alliance, representing 38 First Nations in British Columbia. That ownership stake was acquired in a $715 million deal completed in May 2025, financed through a new federal loan program specifically designed to enable Indigenous groups to own parts of resource projects. The Sunrise expansion gives those same groups the option to acquire equity in the expanded system. This is not a consultation process. This is equity participation. It is the structural difference between being asked for permission and being a partner in profit. The 38 nations have already said yes to the existing system. They have the option to say yes to the expansion. That changes the political calculus for every future infrastructure project in the province. Verdict: the consent model that has stalled Canadian resource development for a decade just got replaced by an ownership model, and it worked. You just absorbed a lot of numbers. Take a breath, because the thing you need to understand before we go any further is that the math only matters if it changes something in your life, and it will. Whether you pay a heating bill in Victoria, whether you drive a car with a battery in it anywhere on this continent, whether you work for a company that competes with Chinese supply chains, or whether you simply pay taxes in Canada, both of these approvals have a direct, traceable line to your financial reality in the next 3 years. That line is what every other outlet is missing. Here is what every other outlet is missing. The mainstream coverage of both announcements has been almost entirely tactical. Reporters are counting kilometers of pipe and tons of lithium. What they are not counting is the timing. These two approvals did not happen in isolation. They happened in the same week. That is not a coincidence. That is a coordinated signal from the Carney government to 3 specific audiences simultaneously: to Washington, to Beijing, and to Bay Street. Let me translate that for you. When a government approves a lithium refinery and a $4 billion gas pipeline in the same 7-day window, while U.S. tariffs are active and China's rare mineral export controls are tightening, that is not energy policy. That is economic deterrence. It is Canada saying, in the language that markets actually understand, we have the resources, we are building the infrastructure, and we are prepared to route around you. The U.S. market is not the only customer anymore. The South Koreans, according to former Privy Council official Jay Khosla, are, in his words, begging for any source of gas supply right now. The global energy crisis, triggered in part by Middle East instability, has left LNG importing nations in Asia frantically seeking supply contracts. Canada's Westcoast expansion positions wood fiber LNG, in which Enbridge holds a 30% stake, to capitalize on exactly that demand when it enters production in 2027. The pipeline and the LNG facility are not two stories. They are one supply chain. Drop your read in the comments right now. Do you think Canada should prioritize Asian LNG exports over domestic supply, or do both at the same time? I want to know what you think. What you are about to understand is the strategic playbook operating underneath both of these decisions, and why the opposition's critique, however loud, completely misreads the board. First, analytical move. Both approvals are designed to solve the same problem: dependency. Canada's economic vulnerability in 2026 is structural. 67% of Canadian exports currently go to the United States. The tariff environment has exposed how dangerous that concentration is. The lithium refinery and the pipeline are both, at their core, diversification instruments. The refinery diversifies Canada's position in the battery supply chain away from Chinese processing dominance. The pipeline diversifies Canada's energy customer base away from the American market. In plain language, both projects are Canada building doors so it can walk out of rooms it has been locked in for decades. Second analytical move. The Indigenous ownership model embedded in the Enbridge approval is the template the Carney government intends to use for every future major project. The Stone-Lasek 8 deal, 38 nations holding a 12.5% equity stake in the pipeline system, bypass the legal and procedural obstacles that have delayed or killed projects for years. By converting potential opponents into equity partners, the government removed the litigation risk. By using the federal loan program to finance the acquisition, it removed the capital access barrier. The result? A project that would previously have triggered years of consultation disputes moved from application to approval in a timeframe that Enbridge executives explicitly called unprecedented. What that actually tells you is that Canada may have found a replicable model for getting infrastructure built. And if that model holds, the entire pipeline of delayed projects looks different. Third analytical move. Notice what Pierre Poilievre did not do when this approval landed. He did not congratulate the government. He did not celebrate the Indigenous partnership. He did not acknowledge the pipeline. He said one word, finally, and immediately pivoted to what has not been approved. That behavioral choice reveals a political playbook that depends entirely on scarcity of wins, not abundance. When the wins arrive, the playbook breaks. The opposition's argument only works in a world of perpetual delay, and that world just got 1 week shorter. What that actually tells you is that the political pressure on the opposition to produce an alternative affirmative vision just increased significantly, and they are not ready for it. The historical analogy that fits here is not another Canadian pipeline. It is the 1956 Trans-Canada Pipeline debate, the last time Canada's energy infrastructure became the central axis of a federal political confrontation. That debate ended a government. This one may define one. Matthew Ackman, who leads Enbridge's gas transmission and midstream business, said it plainly to reporters on April 24th. He appreciates the improved tone under the Carney government and sees the Sunrise approval as a sign that Canadian investments can now compete with projects in the United States. Jay Khosla, former Assistant Deputy Minister in the Privy Council Office and current Executive Director at the Public Policy Forum, described the geopolitical context this way. The global disruption to oil and gas supply chains means importing nations are actively seeking alternative supply relationships. Canada's LNG infrastructure expansion is arriving at the exact moment when that demand is most acute. Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson said something that deserves to be held up and examined carefully. For too long, we became accustomed to mistaking delay for seriousness. Seriousness is not measured by how long a country takes to make decisions. It is measured by whether those decisions are thoughtful, credible, and made in a time frame that actually matters. That is a direct repudiation of the approval culture that killed or delayed over $100 billion in Canadian resource projects over the preceding decade. And when Mangrove Lithium CEO Dr. Saad Dara said the electrochemical process eliminates the chemical waste streams that conventional Chinese refining produces, 2.5 tons of waste per ton of product, environmental analysts and battery supply chain researchers found themselves in the unusual position of agreeing with an energy approval. That is a rare alignment. And when people on opposite sides of this issue agree on one thing, you pay attention. To be fair, let's steelman the opposition. Environmental defense was blunt. The Sunrise expansion is, in their assessment, a disastrous climate decision that prioritizes fossil fuel industry growth over Canada's climate commitments. They note that natural gas emissions were the largest contributor to rising global emissions in 2025, and that building 139 kilometers of new pipeline infrastructure locks in decades of fossil fuel dependence at precisely the moment the IPCC says emissions need to fall steeply. That is not a fringe position. It is a structurally coherent argument backed by emissions data. The critics of the lithium refinery are quieter, but their concern is real too. A 1,000-ton per year facility is a pilot project. It is not yet at the scale to materially affect China's market share in refined lithium. The gap between proof of concept and continent-scale supply chain independence is not measured in years, it is measured in decades and hundreds of billions in capital. Both critiques have merit. The clean pivot back, however, is this: Canada is not choosing between climate and energy security in a vacuum. It is choosing in a world where LNG importing nations in Asia would otherwise buy from Qatar or Russian-linked suppliers. It is choosing in a world where American tariffs are actively eroding the value of the integrated North American energy relationship. The alternative to building is not a cleaner world. It is the same emissions profile, with Canadian jobs missing from the equation. Process, not opinion, says you cannot refuse to build and simultaneously claim to be protecting anyone. Think about the next 30 days for that worker in Fort St. John. Their work camps are already being mobilized. The 11 loop segments on the Westcoast system need survey teams, environmental monitors, pipe crews, welders, and camp cooks. 2,500 construction jobs does not mean 2,500 office chairs. It means 2,500 people earning real wages in the ground starting in July. Their heating bill this winter will be affected not by what gets approved next, but by whether this pipeline is in service by late 2028, as projected. Under the approval scenario, it is. Under a reversal scenario, if legal challenges succeed or investor confidence collapses, it is not. Politically, this reshapes the British Columbia and Alberta map. Premier David Eby's provincial Liberals in BC endorsed this project. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has been positive about both the Memorandum of Understanding on a future Pacific oil pipeline and the gas expansion. When BC, Alberta, 38 First Nations, and the federal government are on the same side of a resource project, the political coalition is almost unassailable. The opposition cannot block what almost every stakeholder has publicly endorsed. Globally, the signal is more important than the project itself. Canada has now demonstrated something it has not demonstrated cleanly since Trans Mountain, that it can move from application to approval to construction mobilization without the process consuming the project. The South Koreans are watching. The Japanese LNG buyers are watching. The battery manufacturers trying to route around Chinese supply chains are watching. What they are seeing is a country that is, cautiously, imperfectly, but genuinely, beginning to act like the energy superpower it has always claimed to be. But here is what this story is really about. It is not about pipelines or refineries. It is about whether Canada can convert sovereign resource wealth into sovereign industrial capacity before the geopolitical window closes. That window, defined by tariff conflicts, supply chain realignments, and the global energy transition, will not stay open indefinitely. Now here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. 2 camps. Which one are you in? Camp 1. The Carney government's double approval this week proves Canada is finally serious about becoming an energy superpower, and the model will hold. Camp 2. These are tactical wins designed to look bold, but without a Pacific oil pipeline and without continental-scale lithium refining, Canada is still a raw material exporter with better branding. Which is it? Drop it below. I read every one.